Good afternoon, and welcome to another live stream here on Monticello's Facebook page. My name is Steve Light. I'm the manager of House Doors. And today we're going to be taking a look back at one of the more contentious elections in our nation's history, the election of 1800. For those of you joining us again and have been here for previous live streams, you know already, if you have questions for us, please leave your questions in the comments section, and also always let us know where you're watching from. I am joined today by Dr. Paul Gilje, the George Lynn Cross Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Oklahoma. Paul has spent his career studying the American Revolution and the early Republic, and is currently working on a book focused on the year 1800, a book which will be combining a look at the politics and the personal during that year. Paul, welcome, and thank you for joining us today here on our Facebook page.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So we are, of course, a day removed, or perhaps is more accurate to say, in the midst of a relatively contentious election ourselves, the election of 2020. But our topic today is going to be going back in history to remind us that contentious elections are not really something that's new in our history. And we'll be looking at one of the first contentious elections in our nation's history. And so, Paul, just to start us off, I'm hoping you can begin by setting the stage for us and reminding us, who was running in the election of 1800 and why was this election such a contentious affair?
Well, thank you. I'm going to start by just putting it right out there and say who was involved. It was Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. But you need to understand how they came to oppose each other and why things were so contentious. I think you need to reach back a little bit, and you have to start talking about the intention of the founding fathers in the Constitution. The Electoral College was really created to try to provide a system that would not have political parties, have a system that would somehow or another try to pick the two best qualified people to become president and vice president. And oddly enough, for the first several elections, that's more or less what happened. What happened in the first election is you had George Washington elected as president, then John Adams as vice president. Then in 1792, Washington again and Adams. In 1796, you had a very contentious election. Ultimately, political parties were just beginning to form, but ultimately there were 13 different candidates who actually got electoral votes. But out of that sort of strange system of all these different people getting 3 votes here, votes there, the 2 top vote getters were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And then, so this sort of sets us up and moves us up to the election of 1800, because in 1800, you had something which is like unimaginable today. You had a president of the United States on one hand, and you had the vice president of the United States on the other hand, running against each other. And of course, now we have, a ticket where the two are identified by a party and the 2 run together. You had actually them running against each other in 1800. And so what happened was that during the 1790s, a series of issues occurred. The political party, which we identify as a Federalist political party, sought to strengthen and enhance the national government, sought to ally itself more and more with its old enemy of Great Britain, while the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Republicans, we'll call them Democratic Republicans, tended to want to minimize the size of government, strengthen the position of the states, and ally itself more with France. And they had these sort of 2 diametrically opposed positions, really focused in on their understanding of the Constitution. Steve?
Yeah, sorry, had to unmute there myself for a second. So talk to us a little bit about these opposing views of the Constitution, and really also can you talk to us a little bit about how these two emerging parties viewed the idea of democracy itself as well?
Yes, I can talk directly to that. I've spent much of the last several years reading everything in print that was printed in the year 1800, reading many different copies of newspapers that were in 1800. One of the things that struck me is that both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans declared that they were the true defenders of the Constitution in 1800. And I thought a lot about this. And not only that, they also declared that their opponents were out to destroy the Constitution. So you get a sort of sense of this if you look at this one portrait of Thomas Jefferson, which I think we have an image of. Hopefully we'll see an image of. Well, I'll keep talking while we wait for the image. The Federalists really focused in on the Constitution that was written in Philadelphia in 1787. And once the people we identify as Federalists sort of took over the controls of the government, once Alexander Hamilton began putting his policies into place, what they envisioned that the U.S. Constitution really had created a consolidated government, that is, a strong national government. And their policies throughout the 1790s were all sort of geared towards strengthening the hand of the national government vis-a-vis the states. And so to them, any challenge to that enhancement of the national government was a challenge to the Constitution. So here's the picture. And what I like about this is that you see Jefferson at the altar of Gallic despotism, and he's being attacked or fought off by the eagle, which is grabbing the Constitution away from Jefferson before Jefferson's about to throw it into the fire. And if you read all the labels there, I won't go into all the labels, but all the labels talk about several of the different political issues that were connected to this election. And I love this image because this image really shows you the Constitution. I'm pointing to it. You can't see me pointing to it. Is the center of what's really going on, and Jefferson is out to destroy it. The Mazzei letter is a letter in which, written in 1796 by Jefferson to an Italian friend of his, in which he criticizes the Federalist government and criticizes George Washington, which in 1799, Washington dies on December 15, 1799. To criticize Washington was called, at that point, was considered sacrilege almost, because Washington becomes this incredible icon. So you have the Federalists wanting to, defending the Constitution of 1787, but then you have the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, Madison, trying to say, no, we're defending the Constitution. But the Constitution they were defending was really the Constitution of the first 10 amendments. The Constitution that we refer to, the part of the Constitution we refer to as the Bill of Rights, which was added after 1787, added in the early 1790s. And in particular, it's really the first, a little bit the ninth, but really it's the first and the 10th amendments that the Democratic Republicans felt were being violated. Freedom of speech, freedom of gathering together, even of religion, because Adams was always, on several occasions, had called for days of national prayer, but it was the 10th Amendment that said that all powers not delegated to the in the Constitution to the federal government are that the states have control over those. I don't remember the exact quotation. Have states over control over that. It was this emphasis on states' rights, and in many ways, and I thought a lot about this, and I know Jefferson is holy ground, but in many ways, if you look at especially the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, look at some of the pamphlet literature that was coming out in relationship to the election of 1800, in many ways, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans almost wanted to return to a situation under the Articles of Confederation. States had a veto. So that is sort of the difference in the Constitution. They're almost two different constitutions. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. And I often talk about this when we have visitors here at Monticello. You have these men like Jefferson and Adams who were working together during the Revolution and who were writing the Declaration of Independence together, and men who framed the Constitution together. And here they were a decade or two later, vehemently disagreeing over what those documents even meant and what the country was going to become. It's very fascinating. Seeing some questions, and I think it's always interesting to think about how elections were different then to now. So we kind of set the stage by talking about this, this split in the views of the Constitution, but the way in which a presidential election in 1800 was held is quite a bit different than the way our elections today are held. Voting is not really the same kind of thing. Could you talk to us about what exactly was the voting process?
Well, let me talk about a couple of different things. Let me talk about the electoral process, both on the larger scale and the smaller scale, because I think looking at the Constitution, the wording of the Constitution is very interesting. Again, I'm sort of referring back to the Constitution. The wording of the Constitution, when it comes to talking about the Electoral College, says that the Electoral College, electors of the Electoral College will be, and this is the word, I find this word fascinating, was appointed, should be appointed under provisions set up by the state legislature. That's what it says, which means, I don't want to get into too much of what's going on over the last 24 hours, but one of the things that has happened in the last 24 hours that we've seen is that states are approaching the way they do their elections somewhat differently. Two states divide their, don't have winner take all. Some states count mail-in ballots beforehand. Other states count them afterwards. The fact that the states do things differently is all reflected by what the Constitution says. But again, the words are fascinating because the words said basically, the state legislature shall determine how the electors are appointed. Technically, if the state legislature voted to say, let's have the governor appoint the electors, that's fine. Or if the state of Pennsylvania, I'm living in Pennsylvania, said, let's have Paul Gilje appoint the electors, because we really like him. He's a great guy and he knows so much. He's been studying history his whole life. Let's have him do it. Constitutionally, I don't see anything that would be against that. Fascinating thing. In 1800, 10 states had the electors selected by the legislatures, not by a vote. 5 states had a vote. 2 states had winner take all. 3 had districts voting. If you look at that situation, that's a very different process. It sort of sets up a whole different way of doing things, a whole different type of time scale. Because if the legislature is going to determine how the electors are chosen, then the election that counts is really the electors. So that's sort of the macro answer to that question. But the micro answer, again, is very different. Almost all the states had a limited franchise. That is, the right to vote was limited with some variations to white men. Some African Americans voted. In New Jersey, some women voted. but otherwise it was white men. There were property qualifications. And when you went to the polls, you didn't go into a little booth in the privacy and vote however your conscience dictated. You went in and handed in most states, and we have a ballot, not a sample ballot, but a list of nominees from the Republican Party, Democratic Republican Party in Virginia, I think, also as an image. You took a list in, and either sometimes it was printed like separately and handed out by the politicians, or sometimes you just sit there and you copied it, but it wasn't uh, a limited election, a private election. It was an open process, which of course means that all kinds of influence and all kinds of other uh, uh, incursions onto one's right to privacy. It's not until 100 years later almost that we get a secret ballot. So it's truly kind of amazing world. It's a different kind of political world than we have today.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can even carry that forward and say, well, then how does the actual art of persuading voters or the art of campaigning work? Because obviously they had very different notions about campaigning. We know famously that, you know, men like Jefferson and Adams weren't going to campaign themselves, but as you say, several of the states apportioned their electors based on their state representation or their state legislatures. So that would presumably mean that the campaign for president stretched much longer than, you know, just the lead up to election day, right? So what does the actual campaign look like in 1800?
Well, let's talk about this again. I could talk about this in many different ways, but let's talk about the last point you made. Talk about the chronology of the election. So, in all likelihood, if the election begins in the fall of 1799, when the Virginia state legislature gets elected with dominated by Democratic Republicans, they quickly pass legislation to set up the next the appointment of the electors in 1800, and they determined winner take all because in 1796 Adam won some electors in Virginia, and they wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. The state of Pennsylvania also has an election in the fall, and the Democratic Republicans gain the governorship, gain the lower house, but they don't gain control of the upper house. So in January and February and into March, the Pennsylvania state legislature is deeply in debate over how to pick electors. They want to have a popular election for electors, but the Democratic Republicans want a winner take all because they think they can win it and take it all. And here's like some of the bizarre things about the election of 1800. The Democratic Republicans argue that the reason why there should be winner take all, one of their arguments, is that way we'll make sure that important and proper people, also known as the elite, will be chosen as electors. The Federalists, who we often associate as this elitist party, argue, no. If we have district elections, we will have electors chosen closer to the people, which almost sounds democratic. And you know, it's sort of like a reverse of our assumptions. And that debate occurs from January through March. The legislature adjourns and does not make a decision as to how Pennsylvania is going to choose its electors. The Democratic Republicans wait for the fall elections, hoping to win back the Senate, the upper house in the state of Pennsylvania. They don't. And ultimately, on, is it November 29th? Or I can't remember the exact date, November 24th, the electors have to meet in each state on December 3rd, like 4 or 5 days before they're supposed to meet. The state of Pennsylvania compromises and divides its vote, 7 Democratic Republicans and 6, or I think that was what it was, or maybe it was 8 Democratic Republicans and 7 Federals. But it's like 1 vote difference. So the election is carried out over months and months and months. In New York, one of the most volatile of the areas of the states, the election that really counts is a 3 or 4 day state legislative election at the end of April and the beginning of May, 1800. And once that election is settled, which the Democratic Republicans win, pretty much everybody knows that New York is going to get electors who are chosen by a Democratic Republican legislature. So the process is drawn out. And then sort of the results, nobody finds out about the results until a week into December. The election, the final election, sort of the final state that really dictate what was going to happen in the election was actually South Carolina. And they have a election for the state legislature. No one's quite sure how South Carolina is going. And it's only when South Carolina decides to support both Jefferson and Burr, because again, in 1800, each elector voted twice, but voted twice for president, not once for vice president, once for president. Only when South Carolina decides to do that is the final sort of result of the election clear. And so we have an image of the tally, and you can see what if we can get that image up, we can look at the tally, and you can see that we can check my, it was 8-7 in Pennsylvania, and then in South Carolina, all 8 of its electoral votes went both. You can see Burr and Jefferson, each person voting twice. But you get back to the chronology issue. So somebody writes to Jefferson a letter dated December 2nd, 1800, which Jefferson doesn't receive until December 12th, 1800, which informs him about what happened in South Carolina. Nobody could pick up a telephone. Nobody could type on a computer and tell you what was going to happen. There was no TV saying, "Oh, let's look at this county," or it was an entirely different kind of electoral process. And as late as December 6th, right? As late as December 6th, the British minister, the British ambassador, they didn't officially have ambassadors to the United States in 1800, but the person who represented the great government of Great Britain, a man by the name of Thornton, wrote back to Great Britain on December 6th saying, "Wow, I think things look pretty good for the Federalists. I think they're going to win." 3 days later, he says, "Nope, South Carolina came in, and we know that Jefferson is going to win the election."
Well, and this is where we get into, this is just the beginning of the craziness, right? Because, you mentioned this before, you have Jefferson and Burr, who are the Democratic Republicans' ticket. But of course, there's no separate ballot for vice president. You have each elector voting twice. One votes for one guy, another vote for another person. And the way that the Constitution originally read, not anticipate political parties, is the person who comes in first is president, and the person who comes in second is vice president. And
right. And that
96, that resulted in political opponents, Jefferson and Adams being president, or Adams and Jefferson being president and vice president. But in 1800, it causes a different kind of problem, which is at the end of the day, Burr, who is clearly the vice presidential candidate, is tied with Jefferson, which is where the real fun starts, right?
Well, it depends what you call the real fun. Yes, it created a very serious problem that, especially in South Carolina is the one that ultimately did this by, again, with both each South Carolinian elector voting equally for Burr and Jefferson, which had happened in all the states, and then you have a tie. So, the Constitution is clear. There's a procedure to deal with this. If there's a tie, well, first, if nobody gets a majority, Congress decides, and Congress votes by states. If there's a tie, the people who are tied, the election goes to Congress, which votes by states. And again, this is a very strange situation. But I should also add, it was a situation which the founding fathers almost anticipated and welcomed. Not that it was welcome in 1800. People were very stressed by this. But when you have to look at the whole process of the election of the president, almost like a series of filters. The founding fathers in Philadelphia wanted to have the input of the people, but in many ways they distrusted the people. And so the purpose of creating an electoral college was to create a group of individuals whose judgment would be national in scope. And everybody assumed Washington would be elected first president, and that was fine. But it's kind of half assumed afterwards that it may not be clear who's going to win. Remember, in 1796, there were 13 people who got electoral votes. So it wasn't clear that maybe nobody would ever get a majority ever again. And that was okay, because then the states would settle it through the vehicle of Congress. Well, of course, this turns out to be a terrible idea, especially in 1800, because, and there's still a lot of mystery about the whole process. But when in February, when the votes were finally tallied and counted by the person who essentially tallied the votes was the president of the Senate, and I state it that way because hopefully many of our listeners and viewers will know that the president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States, who in February 1800 was Thomas Jefferson. Similar in 2000, Al Gore oversaw the election of his opponent in that election, although from a different party. Well, Jefferson submits the tally, and then Congress goes through, and it's not until the 36th ballot over a course of several days before the election is finally settled. And so there's all sorts of discussion, and lots of people who've written about this kind of say, was Burr trying to manipulate and try to get the Federalists to support him to become president? What was he really trying to do? And of course, ultimately what he did is he alienated Jefferson, and I don't think Jefferson ever really trusted him again. Steve?
Yeah, and of course, that's the pop culture reference that I think a lot of people get now is they think of Hamilton the musical, right? With the scene with Burr and Hamilton campaigning for president, and in a weird way, Hamilton, who despises Jefferson, writing to the Federalists in Congress and encouraging them to support Jefferson over Burr, which is fascinating. Another aspect of this election, which some historians have kind of written about, is the role that slavery plays in the election. Now, of course, neither of these parties, the Federalists or the Democratic Republicans, were really anti-slavery parties. That's not really a development on the national scene until much later. But as a result of the 3/5 compromise, of course, in the Constitution, some historians argue that Jefferson receives an unfair advantage in the Electoral College. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Again, we have to go back to the Constitution. I mean, ultimately, the Constitution is what we measure everything by when it comes to elections. And in the Constitution, in the Constitutional Convention, they were trying to figure out how to calculate representation, and they came up with something which we refer to as the 3/5 clause. That is, and when counting people for representation, enslaved persons or unfree persons, which I think is the phrase the Constitution uses, would be counted as a 3/5 of a person. Or another way of saying it, for every 5 enslaved person, you count 3 people towards your total tally. So there's 2 ways of looking at this. One way is to sort of say, and some Northerners said this during the Constitutional Convention. One way of looking at this is saying that, well, we shouldn't count any enslaved person. Why should we count property? If we're going to count this kind of property, why can't we count other kinds of property? And objected to that. In essence, what this meant, and I actually have looked at this a little bit, this meant like a place like Virginia, which was the largest state in terms of its population and geographical size at the time, had 25% more congressmen and 25% more electoral votes, more or less, than it would have if you didn't count enslaved people. The same was true for South Carolina. So if you took away the electors that were attributed to these individuals because of that, then Adams wins. But I should say there's another way of looking at this, which most historians do not talk about. And that is, and on one level, it's an absurdity to say this, that is, why not count the enslaved person as a full person? And in that sense, I mean, because they're people. Now, they're people who are enslaved. They are people who quote unquote unfree. But if you counted, 5/5, in other words, every slave counted as a vote. The vote in the southern states would have been even larger. And we don't like to think of it in those terms, and it probably would have created a problem. But we still sort of have this. Who do you count? How do you count people? Again, I don't want to get into too many current issues. Do you count immigrants? Do you count illegal immigrants when you're counting total population? Yeah. How do you count people? Lots of people did not vote in 1800, could not vote in 1800, except for New Jersey and not for a couple hundred women. Half the population couldn't vote. We don't let children vote. Anybody under the age of 18. In 1800, that's over half the population. I'm not advocating one thing or another. I'm just sort of suggesting that the issue is pretty complicated. Yes, Jefferson got an advantage by the way the Free Clause operates.
And so, we were talking about the drama of this election. So it takes months going through, how the different state legislatures are going to fall, how they're going to calculate their ballots. It takes until December to even figure out who won the election. And then you have this tie and you go through 30-some ballots in the House of Representatives, and you're getting close to Inauguration Day, and we still don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. So this was an incredibly tense time, and we're only talking, 13 years after the Constitution is written. So this is an early period in our history, and I'm willing to bet that there's lots of people who are looking at the situation thinking, this is not tenable. This is going to fall apart the Constitution. What's going to happen here? So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, does this election shake the people's faith at that time in the process? Does it shake their faith in the Constitution and the electoral system and how it's all set up? And if so, how did President Jefferson, when he's eventually elected, seek to kind of restore that faith?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say if the people had their faith in the election process shaken up. Certainly, Federalists did, and were very distressed because they assumed that Jefferson would put in a series of policies which would essentially dismantle the Constitution as they understood it. Jefferson didn't do that. He followed different policies. This is a peaceful I mean, the beauty of the election of 1800, and there's no gainsaying this. The beauty of the election of 1800 is that it was a peaceful transfer of power. That, yes, at one point, the governors of Virginia and Pennsylvania, both Democratic Republicans, talked about getting their militia out in case the Federalists attempted to sort of ignore the results, sidestep the results. But one, the Federalists did not do that, and two, that never came about. So the Federalist leaders were very distressed and felt, that's it. The Constitution is gone. But that didn't happen. Jefferson did not, fully instate the 10th Amendment. He did not fully instate the policies he argued for in the Virginia resolutions about that a state has a right to nullify a law. And in fact, at various points, like during the embargo, he extended federal controls. So there's that aspect of things. But Jefferson, famously, in his inaugural, reached out to his opponents. And how sincere he was or not sincere he was, on one level, doesn't matter. What matters sometimes is the words you use. And he declares, we are all Federalists and we are all Republicans. We are all Americans. And I think by doing that, he was reaching out. And the dramatic policies that were anticipated were not necessarily put into place. Historians debate as to how much Jefferson really meant, those words. I tend to take him at his word. I think that there still was this intense sense built into the Constitution. Again, I'm reaching back to the Constitution. This intense sense that we should be above parties. Even as Jefferson and Madison were organizing a political party, even as, I wouldn't say John Adams organized a political party, but even as the people around John Adams were organizing a political party, they really did not buy into the idea that there should be permanent political parties. These were temporary arrangements. And those temporary arrangements began to disintegrate in a variety of ways in opening decade of the 19th century.
Yeah, and it's interesting for such a contentious debate around this election. Of course, it takes a number of years, but at the end of their lives, Jefferson and Adams are essentially best of friends and exchanging letters with each other for the last 14 years of their life, which is interesting to think about. Paul, I have one last question for you. As we look back on the election of 1800, what would you say the ramifications were, both at the time, but more broadly today? Are there things today that are a legacy of the election of 1800?
I think first, on a pragmatic level, the 12th Amendment was passed. The 12th Amendment fixed the problem that was created by the election of 1800. The 12th Amendment essentially says that each elector does not cast two votes for the president. Each elector casts one vote for the president and one vote for the vice president. That solved a major problem, and obviously has ramifications for today because that's how we vote today. When we watch the returns coming today, we watched not, does Trump and Pence have the same number of electoral votes? Does Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have both vying for each other against each other for presidency? No, one's for the president, one's for the vice president. That's a big deal. Second thing, and not to get a little preachy, but maybe to get a little preachy. The fact that there was a peaceful transfer of power. Yes, it got really tense, but probably the biggest tension was between what the Federalists were trying to do to deny Jefferson the election when the Congress was voting by states. That was probably the biggest tension, not the election versus Adams versus Jefferson. The fact that there was this peaceful transfer of power from one group of individuals who held one set of ideas to another group of individuals that held a different set of ideas. It was one of those things that establishes a tradition in America, a tradition which we have inherited. And I think that tradition, that passing on of power, which we have seen, we could count the times, but I'll use the word countless times, repeatedly in American history, is a really big deal and has become, I think, a major strength of what our nation is, has been, and will be.
Well said, and thank you so much, Dr. Paul Gilje, for joining us today to shed some light on the election of 1800 with us here today on Facebook Live. And thank you all who tuned in to watch with us today. Just a reminder to tune in again next week for our weekly live streams on Facebook. We will be talking next week about one of the more iconic and memorable artifacts, objects that we have here at Monticello, which is the Great Clock, Jefferson's Great Clock, which hangs in the entrance hall here at Monticello and its recent restoration. So stay tuned for more details about some live streams related to that. And Paul, again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to have you and to listen to your insight on the election of 1800.
Well, thank you.